Welcome to our conference today. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. David Nichol. He is the co-founder and executive director of Earth-Rising, the Gaia Field Project, and the Institute for Subtle Activism. He's the author of Subtle Activism, the Inner Dimension of Social and Planetary Transformation, the first comprehensive study of the idea that collective focused intention can powerfully contribute to social change. He has taught on subtle activism in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, for the Shift Network, and for the Institute of Subtle Activism. A former environmental lawyer from Australia, he now lives in Mendocino, California, with his wife, Kate, and dogs. You can find him at earthrising.one. Welcome, David. I am really happy to get to talk to you today and bring your insights to this audience.
Thank you, Chara. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I know from seeing some of your writing recently that, like me and like many right now, you are trying to step back and see clearly what exactly are we experiencing on this planet at this point in history. And is it encouraging? Is it positive? What are the concerns? What are the needs? And maybe even more, what are the goals? What's the vision that you have in mind or recommend? So, let's start there. What do you think is happening? What's the desirable vision?
Yeah, the simple question up front. It's obviously a very rare, special moment that we're in. It's obviously a deeply challenging time for so many of us. And yet, I think this is a moment that many of us have anticipated for quite some time. We saw it coming. We knew that there was an unsustainability in the trajectory of modern culture and incoherence. It didn't really make sense. And so I feel that we are living through this dramatic moment of collective initiation between eras, the breakdown of our modern era, the rebirth into the new. And it's epic. It's can't put too many words, can't exaggerate too much how profound it is. I think we all know that. A specific framework that I would offer, there's many, I think, well-developed visions or models for understanding this shift, and many of, there's many different traditions that offer different ways in to understand such a transition of an era. But one of the frameworks I use is astrology, and a meta framework that helps me understand what's happening right now is that it is the end of this Piscean age that's been with us for about 2,000 years. And we're coming into the Aquarian era. And there's a lot of astrological symbols and signs that speak very specifically to the fact that we are in the midst of this birth right now of the Aquarian age. Some think because it's such a long transition that we've been experiencing the initial phases of that birth since even the beginning of the 20th century. But many astrologers would agree, I think, that we're in a crucial phase now of the actual birth. And when Pluto comes into Aquarius in 2024 for good, then that is a major signifier of entering into that era. And so what I find helpful about this frame is the big picture, that the Piscean age was characterized primarily by a certain kind of structuring of consciousness that was more of a vertical top-down, one-to-many structure. One of the tenets of the Piscean Age is I believe, and how this played out was a structuring in all aspects of culture and society of that hierarchical format where you had one or a few people at the very top of the pyramid, whether this was in the realm of politics or religion or access to information, media, and so on, and most of the rest of us passive recipients of that, and therefore dependent on those sources. And the shift into the Aquarian era, the Aquarian archetype, the chief tenet is I know. And what can come with this is much more of a emphasis on our personal sovereignty, that each of us can develop a unique, direct connection to the source, to a source of creativity, to a source of knowing, along with more of a horizontal structuring of consciousness, so that these decentralized networks will be more the organizing principle rather than the hierarchical models that we've had. And so my understanding, that's the meta framework that I relate to in terms of what we're going through, is a breakdown in those hierarchical systems, these centralized systems, the emergence in many spheres of culture of this consciousness of decentralization and personal sovereignty. And you know, we're at this very, you know, rare moment of between worlds, and we're seeing, I think, the increasing and rapidly accelerating decomposition of the Piscean Age structures, while simultaneously the new structures of the Aquarian Age are starting to come through. And so that's how I'm holding it. And you know, we still have to live it, and we still have to, it's a very human journey on the front lines, you know, even if we might have that understanding. And so we're all facing, I think, a power test right now. We're all going through a personal initiation of how resolute can we be in our own truth, notwithstanding many forces that are acting on us right now that want to pressure us and coerce us into compromising our truth. But this is part of the power test, I think, that's happening personally and collectively as humanity is waking up to this new level of maturity, detaching from our dependence on these sort of parental authority structures and coming more into our own authority, and then developing together, co-creating these new forms of this birthing era.
Oh my goodness, yes. Thank you for that masterfully coherent description. Very resonant for me. I originally trained as a medieval and Renaissance historian, so I can identify with and agree with so many of the ways that you sketched that out. Thank you very much. One question that arose for me as I was listening is maybe to make this a little more concrete for people. When you talk about the new structures, the more horizontal, egalitarian approaches, you know, politically, this could look like a revitalization of democracy, for example. But I'm curious about what else do you think about? I think, for example, about permaculture, local permaculture endeavors, social permaculture, which has a very significant social justice element. But I'm curious about what else you think represents these new Aquarian Age structures that we're moving into.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's coming in so many areas. We're already in the midst of the transformation, and the internet itself, you know, has transformed media in so many ways. And I think that's a good example here, because you have the traditional mainstream media that used to have a monopoly on meaning making, used to be the only ones with the megaphone, and most of us would hear and digest and come into alignment with the voices that came through there. And then, of course, with the internet, everyone can voice their own opinion. So you've had this explosion of diversity of views that are now accessible to all of us. And that's brought many problems in terms of how we now make collective sense of anything. But it has also led to this radical democratization of ideas. And so that's an obvious area. I think another huge area is financial, and what is emerging with Bitcoin. I know this is perhaps a charged topic for some, I don't know, but I happen to be someone who's very clued into the revolutionary, liberating potentials of Bitcoin. And this is a system that could very much transform the our relationships to central banks. The whole revolution of Bitcoin is that we can be our own bank. We can transfer value to anyone, anywhere in the world, without asking for any permission from anyone, without having to do it through a third party, without having to pay any fees. And in terms of structures that keep this hierarchical system in place, the financial one is so key and so pivotal. So that is one which I think, if it takes off, which I do think it's going to, has massive societal changing ramifications. And then in the area of spirituality itself, just consciousness, as consciousness evolves to come into alignment with this new way, what I see happening is so many more experiments with, it's like a democratization of enlightenment, a democratization of spiritual authority and spiritual creativity. So it's not just the very special enlightened few at the top who bring through the teachings. It is a more natural spirituality, with an emphasis that we are all naturally connected to the earth, to the cosmos, to the source. We all have a channel of connection to guidance. And so more and more processes that encourage, facilitate people moving into their spiritual sovereignty. And at the same time, what we can then do together in terms of tapping into our collective spiritual intelligence, our shared healing powers as spiritually sovereign beings coming together. That's what excites me. That's what I'm really into. And I see that as part of this new Aquarian spirituality.
Oh, totally. It excites me massively. And I appreciate and resonate with everything you just said. Your phrase, the democratization of enlightenment, I just wanted to say that again and bring people's attention to it. That's really profound. And it is happening in all of the ways that you described, partly because of the breakdown of some of these Piscean institutions, like the hierarchical, patriarchal religious structures, partly because of the internet, partly because, as you said earlier, we are undergoing a collective initiation, and more people have, there's different language to use for this, but one type of language is more and more people have expanded their conscious awareness or raised their vibration to the point where this democratization of enlightenment and this spiritual sovereignty that you're talking about are truly unfolding. And it's amazing. I don't know if humanity has ever, at least in conventionally recorded history, experienced anything like this.
Yeah, I know. It's incredible. We can't find the words exactly to capture just how profound it is, this moment. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I would add, for anyone who's listening and is puzzled or skeptical, once you start paying attention to everything that you, David, have just said, there's evidence everywhere, in my opinion. Once you test out the description of the current reality that David has offered, you see its manifestations everywhere. So that may bring us toward subtle activism, because, of course, one of the big exciting questions that arises in relation to everything you just talked about is, what do we do? And I've thought a lot about how in the 20th century, there was very important activism, admirable, significant activism, but maybe it wasn't always fully grounded in a really profound or beautiful vision. And maybe that still happens with activism, that it's a little bit willy-nilly or reactive, or it's anger-based, which has validity, but might not be taking us exactly where we want to go. So what do we do? How do we respond? What kind of activism is called for? And why do you advocate for subtle activism? I think those are some questions that arise, but maybe start by telling us, what is subtle activism?
Yeah, this is a great lead-in, good invitation. So subtle activism it's a path that emerged for me quite organically from following my own longings, callings, inspiration. It sort of came together in a quite organic way, and essentially it's the use of consciousness-based practices like meditation or prayer or ritual for collective healing and transformation, as opposed to just a focus on individual healing and transformation. So in a sense, it's a quite a simple idea. It's that bridge that in our modern world has tended to be the separation of the public sphere, which became only about predominantly rational, scientific, concerns, and our personal spirituality got shunted into the private sphere. So it's about creating a bridge, but through practice. And it's saying that there is a role, a potentially crucial role for practice to have a real effect on the whole realm of collective transformation, and that this could be a missing piece, not the entire piece. We're not saying, of course, that all we need to do is spiritual practice to change the world, but it's in our extroverted culture, our materialistic culture. It is a place that has been very much undervalued and overlooked. And with the digital technology that we have now, where people all around the world can come together and create these fields of consciousness, of healing, of peace, it is harnessing specifically that force for social and planetary change. So, yes, I mean, you in some of the things you said, I think we know that many of the great social movements that have really been effective were ones that had some kind of spiritual vision or discipline or even practice that elevated the movement to a higher level that is not just spiritually advantageous, but also pragmatically in terms of the the moral force of the movement. There's a lot of times in activism, what happens is lower vibration energies come in and can infiltrate the movement. And then there's acting out that takes away the ethical force of the movement, you know, and it becomes less effective, it becomes less compelling. People at large don't feel like that's something they want to align with. And so there's I think, both a pragmatic and a more esoteric sort of power that comes from introducing the actual discipline of practice as part of a more integrative approach to social change. And one of the ways I like to think about it is, you know, consciousness is evolving, and one of the insights that people are talking about at the moment is that, you know, it's as if we're in a kind of war, but it doesn't involve tanks and guns right now. A lot of people are talking about an information war. The information is being weaponized, you know, and it is still a war in the sense that there's a strategic agenda, there's aims that are being, there's a certain kind of force, but it's not necessarily a physical force. And so, you know, in that context, you could say it's like the weapons are getting more subtle. And so our weapons, or our unweapons, that's a phrase a friend of mine, Marguerite Rigogliosio, uses that I like, our unweapons of coherent love, of coherent joy, of coherent compassion, especially when harnessed with a focused group of many people coming together in that way with a specific intentionality, that this is a response that meets the subtlety of these times. And it's something accessible to many of us, that as a way in to offer something that doesn't just sort of contribute to the cycle of reactivity that's so easy to get into right now, but actually offers a higher level holding that can elevate the whole field. So.
Yes, that's very clear. And I appreciate your analogy of war and the war of information and the unweapons, because that's very apt right now. Can you mention some examples of how this looks in practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I can speak to some historical examples first, and then I could speak to some happening today. But you know, World War II, there were some very fascinating examples of this in action. And, you know, maybe even just to back up a little more to say, this is really just a modern name for something that has been with us since the earliest days. And I believe that in many of the shamanic cultures of the past, this is just a natural part of culture. It's just woven in the ceremonies and practices of the shamans, of the community, were engaging on these subtle planes to keep things in balance, to keep the channels of connection open between the human realm and the more than human realm. And so in a sense, we're tapping back into that wisdom, recovering it, applying it in a modern context. Which is why I sometimes call the work I do planetary shamanism, because it works in that similar spirit.
Yes. And I like to point out when this discussion arises that there are all kinds of important current aspects of the discussion indicating that, you know, those of us who do not derive from indigenous cultures need to be cautious about appropriating from them. But I also like to note, in alignment with what you just said, every single human being has an indigenous and therefore a shamanic ancestry. So this is going back to everyone's roots.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I understand your point about the sensitivity there. And it's also something I think that part of the initiation I think that we're going through is about developing Gaian consciousness, for all of us, and to reconnect with our relationship to the earth, which is why I think the indigenous traditions have so much to offer at the moment. But anyway, to go back to the World War II story, so there was an esoteric group in England that you may be aware of that was run by Dion Fortune. And at the outbreak of World War II, she initiated this project that came to be called the Magical Battle of Britain. And she sent out a letter to all of her followers. She had a core group meet every week in a apartment in London, and she had a wider network throughout the UK that did these supportive practices. And this core group consistently met to engage in this particular esoteric practice, creating a kind of archetypal field that they felt was strengthening the collective consciousness of the United Kingdom. And there was a book that was written about it that has fascinating insights into how this works. And they felt that what they were doing was on an archetypal level, connecting with these forms that had a deep resonance with the collective consciousness of Britain. And some of these related to the myth of King Arthur and the Holy Grail, and some related to Christian motifs and myths and energies. And they felt that what they did as a contribution was on a really deep archetypal level, strengthen those energies that would then bleed through to the collective and strengthen the qualities of bravery, of chivalry, of Christian love. And it's a fascinating read. And they were very much feeling the conflict and engaging with the conflict on those subtle energetic planes. So that's one example that I always love to tell. I think it's a fascinating one. I could talk about in Sri Lanka in the 1990s, they had a long, ongoing, difficult, terrible civil war in Sri Lanka. And they had an organization, the Sarvodaya organization, that was headed by Aryaratne, and he's often considered the Sri Lankan Gandhi. And they had a very powerful sort of integral framework for how they were supporting peace efforts in the war. And one of the dimensions that they activated was a series of massive peace meditations, one of which had over 650,000 people gathered together in this city, all dressed in white. They came together from all parts of the country. They joined together in a Buddhist meditation for an hour. They disbanded and went home, and that was the action. And 6 months after that happened, there was a peace treaty that was signed. So of course, there's always a question, maybe we'll get to this, about how we actually know this. It's difficult to quantify these things. Yet, there are many reports from people who are there who are just astounded at the power of that intervention. That was an integral intervention.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, I don't know if you're aware of it or have considered it, but as you give that example, I'm thinking of Lynn McTaggart's work with her Power of 8 intention circles, because I think she has done some documentation, and some of her work has been focused on the Middle East peace process, for example, and they documented practices of intention holding followed by political occurrences toward peace?
They have, yes. And I believe I haven't gone so deeply into her work as I have into some others, which I could talk about. But what I do understand is that they have found very interesting, empirical correlations between the intentions of the groups and, signifiers, statistical signifiers of war intensity going down and signifiers that seem to demonstrate that the intention did manifest measurably. There are other, studies that we could talk about. The TM people, you may be aware, the Maharishi effect is probably the most famous series. And what they did, the Maharishi, who was famous for connecting with the Beatles and brought TM to the West.
Transcendental meditation, in case anyone doesn't know the acronym.
Right. In the 60s, he had this principle come through that when 1% of any given population are practicing meditation, and specifically transcendental meditation, that you would see a tangible shift in any given population. So it's based on a sort of physics principle, as I understand it, from laser light. And in laser systems, there's this principle where if you have an incoherent light particle from, like, say, ordinary light, its impact on the system is just equivalent to, let me see if I can say this properly. It's just like a one-to-one effect of the incoherent photon on the system. Whereas if you introduce a coherent photon, its influence is equivalent to the square of its number. And so what that means is that you only need a relatively small number of coherent photons to achieve a phase change, and then the whole system becomes coherent and it becomes a laser. So it was based on this principle that he said that something like this can also happen at the human level. And then they tested that hypothesis in a series of studies all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they found that initially they looked at cities in the United States where there were 1% or more of the population who had been taught TM and were practicing it. And they looked at the crime rates in those cities as a kind of measure of social harmony. And they found a statistical significance that those particular cities compared with control cities had a decrease in crime compared with the control cities. And anyway, what then happened in the late 70s, they discovered that when you have all the people meditating in one place, like when you do a spiritual retreat, that the effect is amplified even more. And so they revised the formula that in that case, it's the square root of 1% that is needed to have that effect. And so then they were able to test that proactively by organizing these retreats in various parts of the world. Some were war-torn regions, some were just had other issues. And they, then examined statistically what happened when you had that group of coherent meditation and effects on the war or the economy or other indicators, crime rates, and so on. And it's really an impressive body of work. So I went into this quite deeply when I did my research, and it's the kind of thing that the more you go into, it stands up under scrutiny. It's been published in many reputable journals, Yale's Journal of Conflict Resolution. It's been checked by independent statisticians. It's really gone through a lot of checks here. And it's a robust effect. And so that's probably the strongest empirical data that we have, that there's a there to what we're talking about.
That's outstanding. Thank you so much for describing that. And I guess, I'm aware of that, although I wasn't aware of all the precise details you just shared, but it is, I guess, a little concerning and a testament to the need for your work that this phenomenon of applying transcendental meditation in this way has been in practice since the 70s, and most people still haven't heard about it probably. So clearly we need to keep talking about subtle activism. So having studied subtle activism in numerous manifestations, what do you see as the best way in for somebody right now who wants to contribute? Do you think that people need to gather in groups or have a particular type of practice or intention? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, my particular passion is in the potential of the group fields. So that has been my calling and focus. You know, I know of other approaches that are more individual based, where people, I think it's important when you're dealing with collective fields that you're working with some form of allies, whether that is a group or allies on the subtle planes, other powers and forces, because there is something, there is an art to this. You know, there are principles involved, and especially when you're dealing with collective phenomenon, you know, you don't want to just walk into that without the proper sort of support. You know, having said that, obviously, simply just having goodwill and offering prayers of healing and support is always welcome into the collective. But in terms of what I think of effectiveness, I mean, what happened for me, you know, I got interested in this approach in the early 2000s, and I developed a group of leaders in the field who came together to form the Gaia Field Project. And we met weekly for years, practicing subtle activism, practicing different ways. It was a bit like a laboratory of calling on our different expertise and wisdom and co-creating sort of how we do this, learning as we went. And
those were live meetings or virtual?
Zoom meetings,
Zoom,
no,
okay.
no, we didn't have Zoom back then. It was but
right.
Yeah, and we would sometimes meet in person for retreats and things like that.
Yeah.
But what emerged at a certain point in my own process, after I had written my book, I had this feeling inside that there was another level that I hadn't found yet, that had more power, more specificity in how we actually do collective healing. Because, you know, I had done a lot of research in the literature and the spiritual literature, and it's kind of scant pickings in terms of specific knowledge of how we actually engage on these subtle planes for collective healing. There's bits and pieces here, which I found. But I kept on thinking that I was going to find some teacher or mentor who was going to tell it to me. And then eventually what happened was I just put out a prayer to the universe, like, please show me how we do this. And it was kind of this pivot point in my own journey. What happens to me where I was like, okay, I'm done looking for intermediaries between me and source. From here on, I'm just going to trust my own connection and what comes through me. And almost immediately after I made that decision, for me, this process was given to me that came through, which has been this particular way of working with group fields to create these very profoundly coherent fields that are made of our shared deeper essence in connection with the vaster healing powers of the earth and the cosmos, and the group field becomes this channel for, you know, these very vast energies, and everyone who engages in that sort of group mind, group heart, group will knows innately or intuitively that that kind of field has the power to impact things on the collective level, has the power to hold collective trauma, for instance, which is not something I think individuals should do, but groups who come together in that way can do that. It has the power of collective visioning, and just there's an innate understanding. Yes, this is bringing through something that is more than just serving ourselves. This is flowing out into the collective on a deep level. So, you know, we have various offerings that, and, you know, I can talk about that.
Yeah.
We're not the only ones. What excites me at the moment is how many different nodes are developing that are working in this kind of way. And the emerging synergy between those nodes is what I think is the real magic vehicle to the new era that can support a phase shift on a very deep level.
Yes. Yes, I very much agree with you there. And that is all about supporting in a focused and profound, conscious and energetic way this collective initiation that you spoke of earlier in our conversation.
Yeah.
So before too long, I would love to hear even more specifically about what Earth Rising is doing right now. But feel free to give any more examples if you want to, or mention anything else that's really on your mind or that you want to offer to our audience. Yeah. Based on our conversation so far.
I mean, you know, in terms of more modern examples and in our work, I mean, the last 4 election cycles, we've run what was called a Wise USA campaign. This last election cycle, we called it Heal Us, Heal US, Us, the Magical Battle of America. So we were actually trying to tap into that field from that project in England. And I have to say, for me, like, these projects have been the most fulfilling things I've done on this earth. And when we gather together, it's something about this conjunction of meaning that happens when you have something that's actually happening in the real world, like the election, the US elections that have such impact on the world, but coming together in this profound holy space, sacred space, holding that in our awareness, holding so many subtler dimensions of meaning that feed into that process that are normally completely left off the table in terms of political discussion, like the other factors, the past traumas that are being activated, or the dimension of the land, or the grieving that's happening about what we're losing, and adding all of these dimensions to our participation in that process, and feeling that we're together, creating an energetic presence that's in harmony with the earth, that's in harmony with the stars, and is holding space for the highest and best unfolding of that profound process. Even as I'm speaking about it, I can feel like you start to come into contact with these higher levels of meaning. And so those have been as I say, some of the highlights of my career is engaging in that way.
Yes, so beautiful. I really appreciate that you are giving attention to the aspect of collective trauma. That's something that I've really paid a lot more attention to in the last few years, the debilitating impact of both collective and individual trauma, and how clearly we need to address that very deeply and comprehensively and lovingly in order to keep proceeding with this collective initiation.
Yes. Yes, I think it's a very, very key piece. And this is, I mean, I think it's so meaningful right now, because part of my understanding about what's happening in the world today is that you know, some of the ways that these darker forces can move in the world is that they come in through our weakest places. They come in through our wounds and our traumas. And so the best defense we have against them is to do the healing, whether it's on ourselves personally, but also collectively. And I think that this has been so, you know, some of these collective wounds of racism and sexism and disconnect from the earth, they've been such wicked problems to solve because we haven't known exactly how. We haven't really had, I think, the tools of consciousness in our modern Western societies, the understanding. If they're just addressed in the political arena, then it's not adequate, I think, to create the holding that addresses those deeper dimensions. And that's why I think it's very exciting at the moment. You know, there's a lot of work going on in the realm of collective trauma healing. And to me, that seems crucial. If we, you know, to be initiated into Gaian consciousness, which I feel is what is happening, then unwinding all of those knots from the past is part of that. But this is where I also feel that this technology of group spiritual intelligence can provide a very key piece, because it's through that sort of exponential holding that a group has in terms of like a much more complex and expansive compassion and courage, that we together can hold those wounds and all together transform, so that we pass through that portal. Whatever our history was, we all have to pass through a portal of coming out of those separate identities and back into our knowing of being beings of the earth together. And so that's such a profound, delicate process, I think, that we're in right now. But these technologies of consciousness, I think, are emerging to meet that. And that's the real hope for me right now.
Yes, I love the way you said that. And they are emerging from so many places, from so many different professional fields. I think about Resmaa Menakem's work, which so beautifully articulates that the trauma of racism is, of course, always worse for those people of color against whom racism is most directly punitive, but it's also traumatic for the perpetrators. And that conversation is going on with gender-related and sexual trauma as well, and violent crime. So it's really important. I mean, fundamentally, it's a realization that we're all in this together in this human earth system. And whether you in certain points have suffered or have been the persecutor, the trauma is there and is shared, and in some ways does need to be addressed on the collective level that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I really resonate with what you're saying. And I think something is happening at the moment where the wounds are coming up, where the feeling that they are to be held only by a certain group of people. It's like it's time, as we're going Gaian, for this recognition that we're all sharing in that, we're all holding that. And I think it's a recognition, as you say, we all already do that. We all already experience that wound on the deepest level, because anything that keeps us separate from each other and from the earth is a wound, whether you're in the perpetrator position or the victim position, you know. And so to see that and to hold it together, that then it can shift the feeling of how we approach that. And it can be that feeling of solidarity while we're engaged in the project together of entering into this new Gaian era. That's how I hold it.
Yes, thank you for the way you stated that. So last thing I want to ask you before you tell us specifically how people can work with you or learn from you more. For you, how does the consciousness of Gaia herself come into this work?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful question. And it's, I mean, I've been on such a personal journey over the last, I would say more like 15, 20 years, where my spirituality has evolved and it's become more and more Earth-centric. I have originally more of a background in more traditional forms of mysticism and Indian mysticism and this sort of thing. And I don't know exactly how to put my finger on what was the cause, but I did more plant medicine work. I did more shamanic work, but just something in my whole being became more and more oriented to place the earth as the at the forefront of my spiritual life, to the extent where I would say the earth is now my primary teacher. And I've had so many magical experiences. I mean, you're just lighting me up with this question, because there's what I love about connecting with the earth as our spiritual focus is the way it activates the magical parts of our own being. Like this is what I've come to discover is like, I mean, the earth magic, it's a whole particular dimension of spiritual life that we can discover or rediscover. I mean, so with this work, the whole work feels like it was guided by the forest. There's a redwood forest down the road from me, Montgomery Woods. I used to come there when I lived in the Bay Area frequently with my wife, and early on when this idea of subtle activism was emerging, I said a prayer to the forest, because it's such a beautiful forest. You're in this sacred place. It's an old growth redwood forest. You have these beautiful streams, and you just can't, your breath is taken away. And I said, please show me how to take this seed and grow it into a forest like you know. And at first I thought it was just a metaphor, you know, but the practice that I have been given, you know, I have a core group that I call the Gaia Tree Circle. And the practice that came through, this original creative practice, it involves this process of the group developing like a group heart and a group higher mind and a group belly. And then these energy lines get connected to the earth and the cosmos, and it forms this tree-like field. And at a certain point, I suddenly realized, oh, they were communicating directly to me. That was like a big shift. You know, there's been many sort of, whoa, it's even more magical than I thought, you know. So it's been a progressive for me initiation into this re-enchanted way of being on the earth. It's an ongoing journey. That's the journey I love the most. And there's one thing connecting with source, eternal source, never goes away. But there's something about this moment in history where it feels that there's a spiritual significance in particular to our collective awakening to the sacred dimensions of Earth.
Oh, yes.
Our what it means to us, the personal, profound connection that we as humans have. We're not indifferent to how it goes on this earth. This is a paradise. This is it matters. And if we can awaken that, that's what I'm here to do. That's what we're here to do.
Oh, yeah. 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 With Gaia as our spiritual partner and teacher in this collective initiation.
Yeah.
I thank you. I'm so glad I asked you that. And I want to mark for our listeners, and this may be of interest to you too, that one of the interviews in this conference is with Dr. Jim Conroy and Bazia Alexander, who do truly amazing work directly communicating with and energy healing trees and plants. I've had a chance to study with them. I just taped my interview with them the other day. It's beautiful. And actually, as we were talking, this extraordinary sycamore tree from down the road showed up for me. And so Jim and Bazia and I talk a little bit about that. But the reason I'm mentioning that for our listeners is if you too would like to have the kinds of experiences that David just talked about, Jim and Bazia have a particular set of tools that welcomes people into this direct communication with trees. Wonderful. I also want to mention that another upcoming talk in the conference is with Rachel Fotenhauer, who channels Earth directly and teaches people really profound but extraordinarily simple methods for experiencing their own direct connection to Earth, for guidance, for healing. So for people who are really intrigued by some of the things David just said, we have upcoming interviews in the series that will give you some specific tools in these directions. Yeah. Thank you so much for talking about that, David.
That sounds amazing, those offerings. And one thing I'll just say about what's emerged in our work that is really quite interesting is that in all of the practices we do, which are more group focused, it's been very profound to create these spaces where we first connect with each other in a very deep way and create this shared field of joy or compassion or peace or love. And then as a group field, open to open these channels to the earth. So we might create a river of love that will then offer to the rivers of the earth, or a pool of compassion that will offer to the forests of the earth. And there's something about doing it as a group that is very significant, because many of us in our modern world, we feel we have to steal away from people to have a private experience of communion with nature. And somehow in our modern culture, it's sort of like you're almost embarrassed because maybe that's somehow not scientific or something if you feel like a deeper communion with a tree or a forest or whatever. But when we do it together, it's like what we're doing is giving each other permission to share in the consciousness of communion with nature. And to me, it plants a seed for a cultural shift in that way, because this is what indigenous cultures did with their ceremonies and rituals is they were having a collective experience of their place in the greater scheme of things as a reminder. So there was that communal support for that particular kind of connected consciousness. And something special happens when you do it in a group that brings in that element of the shared recognition.
Yes, I really appreciate you drawing our attention to that repeatedly in this conversation, because I think so many of us have had the experience in our lifetimes, and maybe in more than one lifetime, of being the lone spiritual practitioner or outcast. And so, I mean, we could go on and have a whole other conversation about this, but I'm really hearing you in your comments about the meaning and the healing potential of engaging in this way in a group.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do people learn more from you or work with you if they want to do that?
Yeah, I would say the easiest way into our work is through a free public offering that we do every month. We call the Web of Light series. And we've been doing this for about 3 years now, and there's a wonderful community who are already part of that. And this is where the basic vision for this came to me from walking in the forest. And I felt like it was a message from the spider wisdom. And the communication was, just as the spiders play this role in the forest ecosystem of controlling the population of insects, that something like this was needed on the planetary level to control the excess negative emotions, those energies that are flying around. And so we've woven together this multi-strand web of our essence, working with these different qualities: joy and peace and compassion and love and strength and courage and power. And we work in communion, as I was saying, with the natural powers of the earth and the cosmos. And we often then direct those healing energies to specific things that are taking place in the world, areas of culture, and to support this initiation. So it's a free event that we do on the second Saturday each month, and I'll provide the links to that. But that's probably the most accessible initial way in, I'd say, to our work.
Yes, and you also offer some courses, is that right?
Yes. This year we're probably taking a pause from that because we're just developing other aspects of our work. We have a core group that we call the Gayatri Circle. So if people want to go deeper, we have this core group that meets weekly, and we have these 6 monthly cycles for people who want to participate at that level. So that is another deeper way in for us. I also offer experiential astrology webinars. That's another love of mine. So on the full moon, I'm offering experiential astrology webinars. And we will be developing more subtle activism programs. We're in a building phase this year, so those are probably going to come out next year, but they will come.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. David Nichol, thank you so much for your time. This was a great joy to me to get to talk to you, and you've offered us so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chara. It's wonderful what you're putting together here, and we obviously share so much resonance in what we're doing. So I really enjoyed being here. Thanks for the conversation.
This has been a presentation of New Earth One Network, your home for New Earth living. Access information, education, and videos on living from the heart in unity consciousness. Visit newearth1.com.